Welcome back to Quilts and Other Happy Accidents. I'm Sherry. I'm working on that sampler quilt. I decided I wanted to do a sampler quilt, but I wanted to do a twist so that each block is a little bit different and represents a month in the calendar. So it's a calendar sampler quilt. Why not? Again, I'm only using things from my stash. And as I was thinking about August, because this is block number 2, I came across this block. It's called the Devil's Claw Quilt Block. And I thought, it's easy, could probably do that. And I chose some um, really fabric that reminds me of summer. Isn't that great? And I'm just pairing it with an off-white. I'm going to be really honest. These instructions have really inspired me to help you and myself in figuring out how to read instructions and what am I going to do with it? Because these instructions require a scant 1/4 inch seam allowance. And when I read that, I never know really what a scant 1/4 inch is. I will tell you, I have since learned it's probably 1/8 of an inch because I messed up the first block I made. It didn't turn out at all. There's also some other things in here that are a little weird. So all of these measurements are like 7/8, 7/8, 7/8. I don't do 7/8. So what I'm going to do is update these instructions so that they suit some of our quick and easy modern ways to do flying geese, half square triangles, etc. Let me show you what I've done. So this is the breakdown on the devil's claw and what each component is. That was the other thing about this pattern. It doesn't really tell you how big these pieces are when they finish. So the instructions do say that it finishes and makes a 12-inch block. Okay, but when I look at this, I see just a 9 patch. It's a variation of a 9 patch where the middle is bigger and we're using these flying geese in this big section, but it's still a 9 patch. Here's the instructions as I've modified them. So as I went through, this is 2 fabrics. One is labeled brown, one is labeled white. And this 1/4 square triangle originally called for a 7 1/4 inch block. It needs to be 7 1/2 inches. The other components of the brown, which will be half square triangles and flying geese, were listed at 3 7/8. I'm making them 4 inches. It gives me just a little wiggle room so that I'm sure I have seam allowances and can square things up. The white calls for 2 of these large 7 1/2 inch, my version. One of them will become flying geese, and the other one will become the 1/4 square triangle. And then we have 2 4-inch blocks that will be the half square triangles. I know it's a little weird, but it gets even weirder. I underlined in green on this 7 1/2 inch block. We're going to only use half of it. So the original instructions had you cut these big squares into triangles. And good golly, that would be a lot of potential stretch and warp. I'm not going to do that. We're going to do that modified flying geese and modified half square triangles so that we can keep this as square as possible and keep it nice and neat. I'm going to start with the half square triangles. Half square triangles are not at all hard to make. They do require some attention to detail. And again, even though we're not cutting corner to corner and then sewing, there's still an opportunity to stretch that bias a little bit. So I'm going to use my clips, and you'll see me use 2 or 3 different rulers today. This 6.5-inch ruler has been my go-to for years and years and years. I find it a really handy size. So I'm going to first draw my line. I've sharpened my pencil, and I'm going to try to get this as close as possible from corner to corner without stretching this fabric. So that looks pretty good. Because every time you stretch the fabric, your pieces are going to be a little off. Now this will be my cutting line when we get these 2 sides made. I'm going to use this and do a 1/4 inch on each side. You could draw a line there if you choose to. I've got my 1/4 inch mark on my machine so that I'm quite comfortable with that. Again, allowing for the thickness of my chalk line. There we go. Square these 2 up as close as I can. And I'm just going to clip them for security. Oops. Now we're going to go to the flying geese units. This one always bends my brain just a little bit, because these flowers are going to be my background. And so I'm going to mark this, again, trying not to stretch it, just corner to corner. And we're going to set this on this big square and line it up as close as we can so that these 2 diagonals not just meet but overlap and have one continuous line. I'm going to use more clips on this one because it does jiggle around. Now you could use pins. If you're bold, you could just take it to the sewing machine. And I'm going to sew on each side. Correction. Yes, I am going to sew on each side of this, and then we'll come back and make the rest of our flying geese. Now this large square is going to be the center block, which is your 1/4 square triangle. This one is a little different. On all of these others, I'm going to be sewing on each side of the line. For this one, I am only going to sew on one side because we only need half of it. This is my other square that I use most often. This is my 12.5-inch square. You know, the old carpentry rule, measure twice, cut once. That applies to quilting as well. You see how light I'm pressing so that I don't get a stretch on this bias. Box. All right, I'm going to go to the sewing machine, put seams on all of these, and I'll show you what happens when we cut them apart. One. So here's our large squares that is going to be the center block. And as I said before, we only need half of this. But what I wanted to show you was, look at the 1/4 inch seam there. So we've got a really good accurate seam. And I am now going to cut So the other way you can use, especially a large piece like this, is yes, you can match up the corners, but this beautiful line here that is that 45-degree angle is very helpful. And there's the first half of our quarter square triangle. Here's the corner pieces, which are going to be the half square triangles. And I wasn't quite as accurate on this one. I got the wobbles, as you can probably see. I've got a little wobble there. But you know what? As long as I can press it out and square it up later, that little wobble won't matter. There we go. Those will be my 4 half square triangles. Over here is going to become our flying geese. I'm going to go ahead and remove the clips so that I can measure. And I just want to see how close I was to that 1/2 inch. I'm pretty dang close. I'm pleased with that. So again, I can use this 45-degree angle line. To make sure I'm going to get a center cut that's going to be straight. And now we'll go press it. For this pattern, I will be pressing to the dark side. Okay, I've done my pressing. I pressed it to the dark, especially because there's so much contrast between these two. Here is step 2 of the flying geese. Just like before, we're going to measure from corner to corner. Try not to stretch that bias. There we go. And I will sew on each side of this, and when I do that, we'll cut it apart and we'll have a flying goose. Isn't that wonderful? Here's what's going to become our quarter square triangle. Right now it's a big half square triangle. So what I'm going to do is line this up as best I can from corner to corner to get as accurate a cut as possible. We're going to cut it in half. Sometimes quilting takes courage, doesn't it? There's a reason my channel is called Quilts and Other Happy Accidents. Is because sometimes, even when I'm 100% confident I'm doing something right, I find a way to not do it right. Case in point, we cut, correction, we sewed only on one side of this piece because I only needed half of it, right? Well, upon further inspection, it is very clear to me I cannot make a square out of this with just the 1/2. So thank goodness I have this other half that I quickly sewed together, and we'll be able to cut it in half. And what we're going to end up with is two center blocks. We can use them later, whatever. I'll be right back. All right, I've made the other block. I managed to somehow get it relatively square, even though I hate sewing on the bias. And now we're going to cut it in half. There we go. Much better. So now we can take half from that block and make this block. It works out the same, and I do apologize for being a dunderhead, but we all have those days. Now, because I pressed to the dark, these are going to nest beautifully. I hope you can see that. And I am going to clip them and sew them. I may or may not sew this other block together. We'll see. If not, it'll go in the future blocks pile. I'll be right back. Okay, I've fixed the calamity of my quarter square triangle. By the way, I also learned that this can be called a hourglass block. So that's an interesting thing. I'll get this pressed. Here's my flying geese. I'm going to cut from point to point. And then you can see we have beautiful flying geese. We'll get those pressed. And then we're almost ready to create our final block. In a flash. Okay, I've got everything pressed. I did want to show you. I pressed to the dark side once and then press to the dark side. And if you're really careful, this will just kind of open up and lay flat so that you can still truly keep that nice square block. You don't have to. You could do this one open. That would work too. Here's my 4 half square triangles. They look nice. Here are my flying geese. Now, oh, sorry. And here are my 4 flying geese. So I have all the components. There's just one final step. At the beginning, I told you I didn't like that the people that developed this didn't give me sizes. So now I'm going to give you those sizes. These corner blocks, as they are raw, are going to be 3.5 inches each. The flying goose block is going to be 3.5 by 6.5. And this quarter square triangle or hourglass block is going to be 6.5 inches square. I am going to square these blocks up since I rounded up on all these sizes, and I'll show you, there's very little waste here, but it is important because we were working with biases, and so these blocks are going to stretch just a wee bit. I'm going to be bold and start with my 6.5 inch center. The beauty of having these squares is you have your diagonals on here for your 45-degree lines. And that tells you exactly where you need to trim. And here you can see that little wobble that I've gotten along that bias on each side. But we have lots, we don't have lots, but we have plenty of fabric to work with so that we can square this up beautifully. I could have gotten my rotating mat out so I wouldn't have to realign everything, but you know what? I just didn't feel like doing it today. And I lived without that rotating map up until about 6 months ago. So I'm kind of used to doing it this way. There we go. One beautiful 6.5 inch square block. Now let's go to the flying geese. They are 6.5 by 3.5. Really, the most important part of the flying goose is make sure you've got room for that 1/4 inch seam. If you cut this a little too tight, that your goose is going to be pointless. And when you're doing wonky blocks, pointless is fine. All right. As you can see, I've got a lot more to cut off here, but all I'm really going to focus on is making sure I've got that 1/4 inch at the top. The rest of it, I don't really care about because I can trim that off easy peasy. Here's my 3.5 by 6.5. There's my goose point. Looky there. Isn't that beautiful? Oops. Must be time for a blade. And then the last is these 3.5 inch squares. Now, there's a little wobble here. You can see I'm going to have to trim it up, and that's okay. I'm going to set this so, there we go. Now I got it. So that this diagonal, so I keep my points on each end. And this is a 6.5 inch square. So I'm going to take just a little off of each side. Oh, that looks great. We're going to do that all the way around, and then we'll put it together. All right, let's lay this out. As I pointed to out earlier, this is just a modified pine patch. All right, let me get my picture here. There we go. I got it. Ta-da! There it is in all its glory. I'm literally going to sew this row together, this row together, and this row together, then sew them together, and we'll have our finished block. I'm really glad I started this project, and I'll tell you why. I've done so many wonky blocks and um, curves and other things. I think this has been a really good exercise for me in making sure my seam allowances are perfect and squaring things up. Unfortunately, my trimming got away from me and I'm a fraction off on that end. The other end looks pretty good. Let me press it and finish the sewing. One. Well, here's the finished block. It actually looks pretty good. I think doing some straight lines and some traditional quilt blocks is going to improve my skills overall. As you can see, it does come out 12.5 inches. It's a little wobbly here and there, but I think when I sew them together, that'll work itself out. My flying geese, this goose is a little pointless, but from a distance, I don't think it'll show so much. Anyway, I'm glad I started this project. I'm learning a lot as I go. And as I make mistakes and find new ways to do things or different ways to do things, I'll be happy to share all of that. Here's the Devil's Claw quilt block. Block number 2 in my sampler quilt, which represents August. I hope you enjoyed watching this program. Thanks. Oh, wait, there we go. Thanks for watching.